Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Feldman. I'm the Director of Water UCI, and it's my privilege and pleasure to invite you to this Water UCI Speaking of Water event called Global Climate Change and Water Conflict. Where might we be headed? For those of you who are participating via live stream, I want to welcome you as well to this event. As you can see, for those of us in the room, there's lots of food available. Please grab some before we actually get the program going, and then take your seats if you would. This is only our second live in-person colloquium since 2019, and our last event this academic year. The reason for it being the second live event, pretty obvious, I think, to all of us by now, what we've been through the last couple of years. Before I introduce our panel and our esteemed program, a few announcements and housekeeping measures are in order. First, Water UCI has been very fortunate to have the benefit of a special events committee comprised of distinguished leaders from throughout our region who volunteer their time and effort to elevate our external events such as this. They've been instrumental in planning this event, as well as others, and in securing external sponsorship for our entire colloquium series. I want to take this opportunity to ask the members of the events committee that are here to please stand. Let's give it up for these folks. Second on the program, and also posted on the screen, I'd like to recognize our colloquium sponsors. Their investment in the center ensures that we'll continue to provide excellent programs such as this. And let me also take the opportunity to thank in advance the sponsors of the reception, which immediately follows this event. Their generosity is greatly appreciated. The reception will be outside to my left at about 2:30. Next, I'm delighted and honored to recognize a number of distinguished guests who've graciously joined us today. Water Board members, Bill Moorhead with Molten Miguel Water District, Kelly Rao with Orange County Water District, Catherine Freshley, El Toro Water District, and Pierce Swan with Irvine Ranch Water District. And City Council members, Carol Moore with the City of Laguna Woods. It's a pleasure to have you. Hopefully you can stay for our reception as well so people can get better acquainted with you. Last but not least, I want to thank a number of people who've been very instrumental in making this event possible from my side of the fence. I want to thank Doug Colby, the Chief Advancement Officer for the School of Social Ecology, the home of Water UCI, for his great work and the work of his team, Mimi Cruz, Tressa, Han, many others. Thank you for all of your work. And I also want to take a moment to recognize the student posters. We have a number of students. We have a huge educational program in Water UCI. And as you'll see in the reception area, some of the student posters are displayed, indicating some of the projects that they've been working on for the past couple of years. Finally, Dr. Shannon Roback, and you've by now, I think, met Shannon. Those of you certainly on the panel have. She is the Associate Director of Water UCI, and I want to thank you again, Shannon, for all your wonderful work and unmatched organizational skills in overseeing the range of logistics and planning for this event. It's now my pleasure to introduce and to welcome Dr. John Gould, who is the Dean of the School of Social Ecology. John is a distinguished scholar in justice policy, social change, and government reform, who's held key positions in the United States Department of Justice and the National Science Foundation. He assumed our deanship on January 1st of this year, and he leads the nation's first School of Social Ecology. For more than 50 years, the school has been an internationally recognized pioneer in developing interdisciplinary approaches to social problems. John served as the principal investigator for the Preventing Wrongful Convictions Project, a multi-year research initiative funded by the National Institute of Justice. He's the author of 5 books, more than 100 articles and reports on such diverse subjects as erroneous convictions, indigent defense, prosecutorial innovation, police behavior, hate speech, sexual harassment, and international human rights. He has also filled a number of government leadership roles, including senior policy advisor in the U.S. Department of Justice and Director of the Law and Social Sciences Program at NSF. In 2015, Chief Justice John Roberts of the United States Supreme Court appointed John as a reporter for a committee of the federal courts evaluating the operation of the Criminal Justice Act. John is a fellow of the American Bar Association, former U.S. Supreme Court fellow, and a former trustee of the Law and Society Association. He received the Administration of Justice Award from the U.S. Supreme Court Fellows Alumni Association in 2017. My great pleasure to welcome John Gould. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you all for being here today. I learned just a few minutes ago that it is someone's birthday today, and that fine fellow is David Feldman, right here. So we're not going to do it at this moment, but June Lopez, where are you? You are going at the reception. You will be leading us in a course of happy birthday to Dave, will you not? So, Dave, thank you for allowing us to share in your birthday today and for your leadership. On behalf of the School of Social Ecology and Water UCI, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. When we think about why does Water UCI exist and why does it exist here at UCI, we have a fairly straightforward and really logical explanation if you think about it, because within a very small nexus of Orange County, we have virtually all of the water problems that we see across the globe. Whether it's climate change and its impact on drought, wildfire, or stream flow, whether we're talking about risks of sea level rise or coastal flooding, whether it's competition between urban and rural areas for water, or whether it's threats to water quality, all of those issues which we see around the world are found within a very small drive of Orange County here. So it's appropriate to have Water UCI here in our school and at the University of California, Irvine. But it's not simply about the problems or about the needs. Water UCI also is able to find within, again, that small nexus, the folks who are addressing these problems. We are bringing together universities and research organizations, forward-thinking water agencies, and technology entrepreneurs to address these kinds of problems. And indeed, Water UCI is a catalyst for those efforts, proven no more by who's in this room today and who's going to be on the panel today. This is the place to come to for the study and the advocacy and the solutions for problems involving water. And in Water UCI is engaged in many, many projects. I would encourage you to go to the website, which you see the address for on either screen. But just to kind of give you a quick summary, or actually really more a snapshot of the things that Water UCI does. Water UCI is engaged with the state to help address the scientific challenges articulated in the governor's water resilience portfolio. The folks in Water UCI are identifying the sources of contaminants that are found in water supplies. They are ascertaining the effectiveness of tools to address and manage outdoor water uses. And there are many, many other things that our researchers and the team at Water UCI are engaged in. Now, during the pandemic, I became a fan of the television show Ted Lasso, which many of you have seen. And there is one character in the show, his name is Danny, who always says that football, and he means by that soccer, football is life. But with due respect to the writers of that show, I want to say that water is life. Water quite literally is life. And so there are few programs more important than Water UCI and what it is doing to help us manage a sustainable resource that allows us to all keep going. So on behalf of the School of Social Ecology, I want to thank you for joining us here today. And on behalf of Water UCI, I really want to take a moment to ask you to be a supporting partner in the work that they're doing. We're all in this together. because this is a resource that we all need and we all share, and the stakes have never been more profound than they are right now. So thank you very much for joining us here today. I think this panel discussion is going to be fascinating, and I will turn it over again to the birthday boy himself, Dave Feldman.
All right. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Mohsan Murtada, the CEO of 3I Strategies, who has some remarks for us. Mohsan?
Thank you, David, and happy birthday. Thank you for having me here. What a great setting. I think the only thing missing out of here is some seagulls, as we can all tell. So when I was speaking to June about this series and about this specific one, I told her I have some very personal story to tell related to water and conflicts. So I'm going to share that with you today to set the context for the great panel discussion we're going to have in a few minutes. So I'm originally from Syria, a failed state, and failed state because of water. So I'm gonna go through that logic. And so I remember doing a presentation at the Middle East Water Summit in 2006, and I was telling the audience then that there's a big threat of civil war in Syria because of water, and everyone was thinking like there are other threats that are more imminent, which is part of what we do as humans. We discount things that we don't view as imminent threats because they're not as economically visible, I guess, but longer term they are. So Syria has been dealing with water shortages for many years, and there are water right disputes between Syria and Turkey. So if you look at the country itself, it depleted its groundwater in the 60s. For the most part, there's still some sources, but the majority of the water comes from Euphrates River, which comes from Turkey, Syria, it goes into Iraq, and then it ends up in the Persian Gulf. And then there are some other rivers in the south that are not also as, because of climate change, they're not as rich as they should be. So Turkey built a series of dams on the Euphrates, and they're giving Syria a fraction of the water that it's entitled to. Climate change also contributed quite a bit. Less rain, less recharge of the basins. So a lot of farmers that live in the Euphrates areas, which, if you look at the history of that area, the Levant used to be the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. They produced so much wheat, fruit, to sustain such a large empire. That's not the case anymore. So what happened was, with climate change, farmers ended up having no jobs. They really can't sell their produce. They cannot grow anything. So they ended up moving into cities. And the government did a terrible job looking after them, providing them employment or opportunities. And that's really what became rebels of the future. So when you hear, when I hear on the news, I find it so amusing when I hear, well, it's a fight about freedom or about being independent. It's not really that. It's really about economics and having the right economic opportunity to live a normal life. So the sad thing is, if you look at the world now, there are many other places that have the potential to have similar conflicts. And to name a few, and there are many international disputes related to water going on right now. Some are less visible to us because we really don't care. And I'm gonna bring it home before I hand it back to David to tee off the panel. So if you look, Iran, Afghanistan, they have a big dispute over one river there. If you look at Syria and Iraq. There is a dispute there over the Euphrates because Turkey takes what's Syria's rights and Syria takes what Iraq's rights as well. If you look at Mali, if you look at Nigeria and what's happening with Boko Haram as well, that's a big issue. But the really big one that has massive potential is Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. That has such a big impact on that whole, and population-wise, you're looking at probably 250 million, maybe more, maybe 300 million people. My math is a little iffy on that. So the challenges we're going to have, as water professionals and as humans, more importantly, how do we deal with these situations? So if we put ourselves in the shoe of Egypt, for example, if they stop getting water from the Nile or less water, they have two options: to go to war against Ethiopia or to have a civil war like what happened in Syria and have a failed state. So the trend we're going to see, unfortunately, with the lack of water is failed states. And failed states are not going to help anybody because that's going to trigger migration across the globe. Projection for climate change-related migration, and a lot of that is water-related, whether it's rising sea levels or lack of water, is anywhere from 200 to 800 million people by 2050. Population projection by 2050 is about 8.5 billion, so we're looking at 9% of world population moving. So if we put this into context, look at the current Ukraine crisis. We got, let's say, 12 million refugees, and look at the stress that put on the world. So imagine if that multiplied by 10 times, how that's going to look like, or 20 times. That's going to be quite scary. And the last point I'm going to make is migration as mitigation is a big thing what we're going to see in the next decade or two, where people do not have access to water, whether it's drinking or farming, and they're just going to move. They're going to have to move, and that puts another level of stress on water systems and countries as well, which will create a bigger crisis. So to bring this home, I talked about failed states. I'm looking at the state of California, and hopefully we'll never get to that state because I think we have a lot of economic advantage here to look at other water sources. But the problem is seeing what happened to Syria, where I grew up, where it was kind of a normal society, military state, but normal. The descent from normal to chaos is so quick and it's so uncontrollable that I wouldn't put it past any other place to happen. But I don't wish it to happen on anybody. So I think we have to look at minding our own house here and making sure that we keep our house in order and deal with the drought, preserve our water resources better, so we can continue to create the great society we have. So with this, I'll hand it back to David, and thank you for listening.
Come on up to our Adirondack chairs. Whatever it's comfortable for you. Yeah, there we
That's
go.
what I asked. How's there?
All right, let's get right to it. The little placards
Right.
at the center of your tables, if you scan them, it will take you direct to our Water UCI website, and among other things, to the bios of our distinguished panelists. So I encourage you to do that. They really have an incredible wealth of experience in this area and are very accomplished. We're very privileged to have them. To my immediate left is Peter Glick. co-founder and president emeritus of the Pacific Institute. Great to have you.
Happy to be here.
And next to, immediately to his left is Dalal Najib, Director of Science and Engineering Capacity Division, Policy and Global Affairs Division of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And to Dalal's left is Lama El-Hato, Environmental and Climate Change Consultant with the World Bank Group. Very pleased to have you. Welcome again. And last but not least, Professor Aaron Wolf, who is a geography at Oregon State University. So this topic, obviously, is that climate change is worsening freshwater-related disputes across our planet. I want to start out with a couple of questions and just do a kind of a round robin here. Take a few minutes to just react in any way you see fit to the questions. The first question, which ties in very well with our keynote remarks, the increase in climate refugees and other migration-generated pressures has become strongly linked to climate change. What are the most serious migration-related regional conflicts you see resulting from climate change and its impacts on fresh water? Do some of these conflicts result from too much or too little water? And are policymakers sufficiently attuned to this problem? Who would like to begin? Aaron, why don't you go ahead?
I think on this one I'm going to defer
All
probably
right.
to Peter. Yeah.
Sure. So, first of all, happy birthday. Thank you for inviting me. I have to say, this is my first in-person event in 3 years. I've sort of forgotten how to do this. I was looking for how do I adjust the video here? But I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for inviting me. And thank you for that introduction, Mohsan. The story of Syria is, in a sense, a great case study of what we're dealing with here. The region was hit by a very severe drought in the early 2000s that contributed to the agricultural failures in Syria, that contributed to the migration of farmers to the cities, that contributed to the economic unrest and ultimately the breakdown there. The climate science community, and I'm a climate scientist by training, has been very explicit that drought was influenced by climate change. It was worsened, it was worse than it would have been otherwise because of climate change, that there was a clear climate signal there. Of course, the Syrian civil war, as you said, it's not a water war, it's not a climate war. It was a combination of a lot of different things, including social, political, economic, religious, historical factors. But it is also true that climate and water played a role. And so the answer to the question, where are we going to see the biggest problems? It's the places where water is scarce and where there's competition over access to or control of water, where there are failed institutions and governments that aren't able to deal with those challenges, which, again, hopefully California will deal with, but who knows? Where agriculture and food and water and climate intersect. And again, in the Ukraine right now, again, comparatively to some of the risks that we potentially face, I don't want to call it a small-scale crisis because it's a terrible crisis, but it's an indicator of how serious a dispute could lead to international food issues. We're beginning to see that now. And to the question of are policymakers sufficiently aware, I would say no. In general, policymakers are oblivious to these issues, with some exceptions. But figuring out how to engage the policy community is going to be critical. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. Dalal?
Yeah, I think Peter said it all. All I would add is that, yes, this is a complex, multi-layered issue, that there are many elements to it. Climate is one of them. Migration is right there at the nexus of the chain of consequences, driving people from one place to another. But there are also those who are too poor to even migrate or get displaced because they just can't afford to move. In terms of some of the areas that can witness the dire consequences of climate refugees or climate change. Afghanistan right now is witnessing some of its worst droughts in decades. In fact, it is in the midst of a humanitarian crisis that's comparable in scale to what we have seen in other parts of the world. It's always tricky for policymakers, especially when you have a failed state, to prioritize short-term solutions and long-term solutions that make communities more resilient. And even for the humanitarian society or international organizations, they try to tackle urgent needs as opposed to building drought-resistant or implementing drought-resistant policies. In cities, for example, where migrants come, there are many policies that can be implemented in terms of better urban planning, education, implementing safety, financial safety nets. In rural areas that have seen emigration, where people have left, there has also to be policies in place that could make them more resilient. In the case of Afghanistan in particular, that's something, it hits home, not that because I'm not from Afghanistan, but in the National Academy of Sciences, we worked very closely with supporting Afghan water experts to build a human capital and invest in long-term solutions for the country of Afghanistan to work on transboundary water. And when the state collapsed, many of our grantees either left, so that's loss of human capital, or they can't leave home because they're women. So they are experts, and yet they're just, they can't contribute to addressing this urgent need, which is leading to famine and really dire stresses on the population. So that's what I wanted to add here.
Thank you, Delano. Lama?
Thank you. So it's kind of funny. I think I'm on the wrong panel. That being said, did this thing go on? No, it's still on.
Adjusting it.
So my research actually focused on water, climate change, and cooperation. So when I say I'm on the wrong panel, I actually look at it from the flip side of the coin, in that actually climate change, even though it's been pegged as the UN and otherwise as a threat multiplier, I actually look at the aspect of, well, with every crisis stems an opportunity. Where is that opportunity? And I look specifically within my research on how climate change can be an opportunity and a tool for cooperation on transboundary river basins, and specifically I look at the Nile River Basin between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And Mr. Mohsan Murtada, thank you very much for your introductory speech. You were mentioning one of the hot zones coming up, of course, is the Blue Nile between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And specifically around this issue and the controversy around GERD with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And it's funny because, so my research, I'm originally Egyptian, and my research does focus around the Nile. But when we talk about climate impacts, when we talk about conflict, GERD really is sort of being used as this sort of platform to propel sort of the conflict even further. But the irony of the situation is that the empirical evidence that has been shown from policymakers, from people on the ground, from the stakeholders, is that GERD is actually a huge opportunity for cooperation, huge, in the way that we can manifest it. And there are several recommendations. This might not be the right place or time, but that being said, I think that when we talk about water, climate, and conflict, that we really need to focus on the aspects of, it doesn't have to be. We can switch the pendulum to either side towards conflict or cooperation, and the means for cooperation are very much there. So when we talk about sort of, again, hotspot zones, of course, Syria being, in terms of climate migration and climate refugees and looking at how conflicts can sort of spiral, many attributions were being made by the climate scientific community and water community as well in how the Egyptian revolution in 2011 was spurred on by, and in fact caused by, climate change. And reason being, I mean, of course, the thought process, and I'll take you down by this thought process and then come to disprove it, if you will, so pardon me, but is actually how, so the calls for the Egyptian revolution were bread, freedom, and social justice, in Arabic. And bread, the primary sort of slogan of the Egyptian revolution, being that food prices during that time prior to 2011 and 2010 were increasing, due to food imports coming in from China and Russia had increased significantly. Again, also due to weather change patterns that were occurring in that region, which caused serious production decrease in wheat. Again, we see very enormous parallels to what's happening right now in Ukraine, and how that affects the international community, and what does that mean for our wheat imports, and how does that affect international food prices and food stability in today's world. But that being said, it's very important for us to be careful what we attribute to climate change and what we attribute towards other political and economic instabilities that are occurring on a global level. And that's where we as climate scientists and environmentalists and the water community in general really do need to be careful in what we peg as climate change. It is in fact very much a threat multiplier, but can we necessarily say that is the cause? And I don't think that there is enough science yet for us to say that is the cause. You know, the Egyptian Revolution, or Darfur, or Lake Chad even, or many of sort of the examples that come about. Lake Chad is one that for many years, the sort of, pardon me for those of you who aren't familiar, is that the decrease of Lake Chad down to almost a tenth due to evaporation, but very large extraction of Lake Chad has decreased it. And because of it, there's been an emergence of terrorist groups. Even Boko Haram's emergence as a terrorist group has emerged due to a lot of what's been occurring in the water scarcity around Lake Chad. So when we look at these paradigms, we begin to think, obviously, climate change, water conflict, water scarcity, oh my God, we're going to war. But the correlation is not necessarily, it's not a direct causation. And this is, again, where we need to be very careful within those, as scientists, when we direct causation to correlation. So that's one of the things I think that we just need to be very particular on. So very quickly, back to the Egyptian Revolution, before we move on to our very prominent guest speaker, Dr. Aaron, is Egypt is also very complex, just as Syria is. Just like many of these case examples, Afghanistan, Ukraine, otherwise. And this attribution of climate change towards the rising food prices, there is definitely a link, an absolute link that needs to be made and needs to be associated to it. But the causation aspect is one I don't think that we should and can make at this stage. And that's why when we talk about, again, hotspot conflict zones, whether it be, again, the Nile River Basin, or we need to be very careful in how we do it. And again, I'll end this very quickly just to say is that, and this I really do want to emphasize, is this point of moving towards conflict, we really can switch the pendulum towards cooperation. It doesn't necessarily agitate towards this larger narrative of water wars. Is been propagated, of course, by media and sensationalist media and otherwise. But I think that we can switch this towards cooperation, and the cards are in our favor. And I think actually Dr. Aaron Wolf's database proves that, is that there is a very large database proof that empirically we are more likely as humanity to move towards cooperation in transboundary basins. So you can tell us why.
Oh, good, thanks.
Thank you, Lama. Yeah, it's all yours.
So I feel I'm in exactly the right panel, because this is how it's always couched: is it conflict or is it cooperation? The answer, of course, is yes. There's a timeline where water scarcity or somebody's building something, and it drives people to the point of hot conflict. It gets the politicians involved. And that precise crisis, whether it's the dam or the drought or climate change, that precise crisis is what gets people's attention. So come back to your initial question, are we capturing policymakers' attention? I think, yeah, precisely on climate change, precisely because of immigration. And both here in this hemisphere and in Europe, all of a sudden, people of the European capitals are looking up and saying, oh my gosh, water's important. And if you're an altruist, you say, oh, they're finally getting interested in poverty alleviation, and they want to help people, and they want to help people stay where they are. Or you can be a cynic and a skeptic and say they just don't want all this migration into Europe. Regardless, they're talking about water in the southern hemisphere, and we're doing the same. Both Peter and I were on, some of you may have followed this morning, the White House, the vice president came out with an initiative on water security, and one of their pillars is on transboundary waters. And she's very interested. She went into the Lempa Basin, which is in Latin America, and was interested precisely because of the relationship between climate change dispute, and people not being secure in their home. So you have this trend that captures people's attention, and that's where you get the water wars rhetoric, exactly the way we're hearing, and that's the part that sticks in the journalist's and the politician's mind. But then it's precisely that attention, the focus, the resources, the ability to people to focus on these issues, precisely that then leads to sometimes years or decades even of dialogue that then lend themselves to really resilient institutions. And that's where I kind of wanted to bring that together. I think the lesson that I've learned in watching this process happen around the world over and over, if you want to hear about conflict, it's there. There's no question. And Peter also we're on opposite database sides, where he's got thousands and thousands of instances of violence associated with water, and our database looks also at cooperation and purely on transboundary basins. And so the years of watching this timeline take place is one, institutions are really, really important. And so if we take this horrible case study of Syria and watching the drought drive migration to the cities and political insecurity and as it's described as a failed state, the same drought hit Lebanon and Jordan. And both of them nominally were weaker than Syria in terms of the government. Jordan had just taken in a million refugees, and neither country fell apart. And the interesting question then is why? Why is because of the institutions and how the drought was handled, both by government and non-governmental organizations. So I think one, helping not just with the hardware, but also with the software, with the dialogue with the institutions, and having those conversations earlier. We don't want to have to wait for these horrific crises that take tens or thousands of lives in order to capture our attention. The challenge of our time, I think, is can we have the crisis conversation in advance of the crisis that's killing so many people?
Thank you. Peter, I know you wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to thank Lama for raising the important question of language. Language is really important here and how we talk about these things. The climate science community, I think, is extremely careful about what we call attribution, attributing extreme events to climate change. And if you rewind the video, we don't do that anymore, to my comments, I was very clear about the role of climate change in influencing these events, not causing these events. Causality is a challenge, although I have to say it's one of the more exciting aspects of climate science right now is to understand causality with extreme events. But I would argue that the scientific evidence is very clear, astoundingly clear, that climate change is already influencing extreme events. And the way I described it was influenced the drought that played a role in the Syrian conflict. So that's an important point. It's also important, as she raised, to talk about opportunity here. Aaron and I have been friends and colleagues forever, a really long time. Aaron likes to talk about cooperation and the extensive history of cooperation, especially, as he just said, this is also important language, about transboundary water issues. And conversely, this is ironic because I actually think of myself as an optimist, but my institute, the Pacific Institute, maintains something called the Water Conflict Chronology. You can Google it, Water Conflict Chronology. It's an open source database of violence associated with water resources going back 4,400 years. And we have 1,300 entries now of violence associated with water resources. And the bad news is that the number of entries has increased quite dramatically in recent years in different forms. But the vast majority of those entries are not transboundary issues between nations, where there are more diplomatic resources and international treaties and more cooperation, but subnational issues like fights between farmers and pastoralists in northern Africa right now, like violence in riots in Iran over drought and allocations of water between the cities and farms, and in India. So I look at the instances of history telling us where do we see violence associated with water. But because I'm an optimist, I also take the idea of how do we take that information as an opportunity to think about, and this is the key issue, and maybe we'll get to it, how do we take water out of the equation of conflict? What do we need to do to make sure that of all the conflicts that we see, water and environmental issues maybe more broadly, and resource issues and the environment are somehow removed? What do we do to do that? And maybe that's where this conversation can go.
Great. And we indeed will address that issue, and thank you for raising that, Peter. I want to shift gears just a moment and kind of talk about solutions, or sensible solutions. As climate change and its influence on freshwater availability become more apparent, some, as we know, urge greater adoption of large-scale alternatives, such as seawater desalination as a solution. Should this alternative be the first, or one of the first options that placed on the table for policymakers to consider in mitigating the impacts of climate change on water and alleviate regional conflicts, or are there better options to pursue? Peter, let's go ahead and start with you.
Okay. There are a lot of different kinds of water problems. The failure to meet basic human needs for water and sanitation is typically at the top of my list globally. Water quality and impacts on ecosystems, and inequitable impacts on frontline vulnerable communities. And I mean, I could go on. There are a lot of water problems. So similarly, there are a lot of water solutions. And I'm always a little reluctant to put any single solution on the table as the best solution, because it depends on what the problem is. Desalination is a good example. And when I give a talk on water, and probably any of us here give talks on water, often the first question is, what about desalination? 97% of the water on the planet is the salt water in the oceans. And we know how to desalinate. Right. But it's expensive. It has environmental challenges like any of our solutions. So my answer is, look at what the problem is and look at what's the best economically, socially, politically, environmentally appropriate solution. For California, I do not put desalination on the table as the first solution. And again, my institute just a few weeks ago released a new report for the state of California on the potential for urban conservation and efficiency, in other words, doing what we want with less water, wastewater treatment and reuse, and more stormwater capture, all three of which have much greater total potential, economic potential, and environmental benefits than, at the moment, desalination. So I would argue for California, you do the smarter things first. But there are places around the world where desalination makes a huge amount of sense. So when, it depends on what problems we're trying to solve and where we're trying to solve them.
Thank you. Bilal?
Agreed, yeah. But if we look at the different options, so obviously if fresh water is available, that will be the first option. But in places where fresh water is scarce, before getting to desalination, there's water treatment, which is, the cost is higher and the energy footprint is higher than using fresh water. But there is also social barrier to using wastewater, treated water for drinking water, especially in the Middle East, for example. We know people would refuse to drink treated water, but it can be used for agricultural purposes or for industrial purposes, and that way will free resources that can then use fresh water for drinking, for example. Then if we go up the ladder, you have desalination, where the environmental footprint is even higher, the cost is even higher, but at the same time, it's more robust to climate change than using fresh water. And same, by the way, for wastewater, because people have access to sewage water and they have access to the sea, right, if they do. In terms of costs, obviously, for places that are stranded for cash, desalination is less appealing as opposed to countries in the GCC, well, UAE, Qatar, and others, which are more and more reliant on desalination. But there's been many innovations in desalination that made it actually more cost effective. For example, I think it's about 50 to 70 cents per cubic meter using like state-of-the-art desalination technologies. And if you look, for example, for Amman, if they need to pump from, there is an aquifer in the south of Jordan, the DC aquifer, and to pump water all the way to Amman, it costs over $1 per cubic meter to take water there. So then, there are trade-offs to be made. In the Gaza Strip, for example, there are desalination plants. Now, the question comes as these plants can also become casualties of conflict, as opposed to water driving conflict, and it's for various reasons. It's also for like donors being more conservative. They are kind of they are reluctant to invest in bigger plants because of security concerns. So, but if we look, for example, at Qatar during the blockade, them being reliant on desalination, they made them more resilient, given all the geopolitical factors that were occurring during the blockade that just ended recently. So I think, again, as Peter said, it depends on where you are, the resources you have, and all the other factors that are in place when you come to deciding whether it's desalination or water treatment or rainwater harvesting or freshwater usage.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm in complete agreement with my first two panelists on all of the above. I would add, coming from the region I come from, so in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, obviously it's a very water-scarce region, and it tends to become sort of the blanket solution, desalination. Let's head towards desalination. And I think that that's a very erroneous statement to make, is that just sort of this blanket solution in that the Middle East immediately should emerge. GCC countries, that's their only option. Egypt, it has problems with GERD, go towards desalination because we don't know if there's going to be any more water after Ethiopia builds its dam. It just tends to be this blanket statement where we don't end up looking at how we can actually have more efficiency locally and domestically first. And so I would completely agree with my former two panelists on this, is that take a country, for instance, again, I come from Egypt, so many of my examples come from that in the cultural context, is that if we look at water demand management measures, desalination is an incredibly energy-intensive process, which we already mentioned before. Not only is it very energy-intensive, which often ends up using highly, whether it be fossil fuels or otherwise, unless we're reusing renewable energies such as solar, which also has supply chain issues that we need to consider. But that being said, the energy-intensive process, I'm an environmentalist, and so this is the core of what we do, is focusing on how this process ends up being done specifically, not to mention, of course, what occurs with the brine from the desalination process. Is it dumped back into the coastal seas again, increasing the salinity for our fisheries and our coral reefs, impacting the ecosystem altogether? What does that mean for our tourism industry, for instance, if it's being completely reliant on, scuba diving or coral reef? That's something, for instance, in the Red Sea in Egypt, that is a very big thing. Desalination, specifically in my country, in Egypt, is being piloted in the coastal regions on the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean, and specifically on touristic resorts. And for that being said, it makes sense. It makes sense. Put them on the coasts, but what does that necessarily, again, mean for the marine ecosystems that are incredibly reliant on the tourism industry and otherwise? How do you effectively discharge the brine in an environmentally sustainable manner that isn't destroying your asset as an industry, as a country? Desalination comes with many problems, but going back to my initial statement in terms of water demand management, and that's where we need to focus, I believe, our efforts significantly, is that the cost. So again, I work for the World Bank, and we often look at sort of cost-benefit analysis and how does this come down to? And the cost for water demand management efficiency is significantly lower than investing in capital costs for desalination. So a very prime example, there was this study that was done by this colleague, an environmentalist in Cairo University, that was looking at sort of the infrastructure and the leakage systems in many of the government buildings, simply in some of the government buildings around Cairo. So there's this one building, which is, if you're all familiar with the Egyptian Revolution, Tahrir Square, there's this one building, Mogama Tahrir, which is a huge government building complex. And this one master's student simply did a research basically analyzing the amount of water losses that came out of this one government building. And it was a very simple research study that came out, and basically through the assessment of basically the amount of usage that occurs on weekdays versus weekends with water metering and otherwise, she was able to determine that the amount of water losses that came out of this one government building on a weekly basis, and hence translated into a monthly or an annual basis, was 40% water losses from the sewage network, from the water network. That's a huge amount. Investing in repair, investing in water leakages, investing in water demand management measures, locally and domestically, is an incredible water-saving potential that we need to capitalize on before we start looking at new supply measures. Where do we increase our supply in terms of desalination or other water efficiencies? So we need to focus on that in a very, and not only does it make sense from a financial perspective, because it absolutely does, it makes sense from a domestic perspective in how we're actually looking at efficiency and how can we capitalize on the amount of water losses that we're losing in our network systems. But it makes sense in terms of enhancing our infrastructure and readiness towards climate change. When we talk about adaptation, we talk about the readiness and infrastructure of a country to deal with those kinds of impacts and hits that come our way. If our infrastructure isn't ready, everyone's going to be doomed. And that's how you begin to enhance the resilience of a country. So you begin to enhance, and doing so means water demand management measures, means stormwater drainage systems. It means enhancing your rainwater harvesting if that need be. It means looking at gray water recycling. It means looking at all of these parameters before we start looking externally. Oh wait, let's look at desalination and external water sources so we can enhance our supply. So that being said, I fully agree that we really need to focus on all our efforts versus having this one blanket statement saying desalination is the solution, because it really can't be.
Thank you, Lau.
Yep. I love going last. I just say, yeah, what they said. And we don't have to make it up either. I think if we look at countries that have hit the wall well beyond what California and the U.S. have hit, if we look at Singapore or Israel or Australia, they've gone through this. And so just as everybody else said, what's the most efficient way, the most cost-efficient way to deal with the biggest problem? And bottom line is most of the world's water goes to agriculture, and there's no way that desal water will ever be cost effective for agriculture. So what else can you do? You go to drip irrigation, you go to different crops. Tony Allen, rest in peace, came up with this idea of virtual water, the water embedded in goods services. Maybe you import water from elsewhere. Maybe you don't have to grow all your own tomatoes or cucumbers. Maybe you can import them and that way get past your water. And then you look at all the other inefficiencies in your systems, your toilets, your pipes, your showers, your absolutely all these other efficiencies, and then only at the very end, and then you start moving wastewater to you start thinking like you're on a space station, right, where it's a closed system. And so if you look at Israel, they have 3 delivery systems. They have one of brackish water, they have one of fresh water, they have one of wastewater. And each one goes to, so when the wastewater is treated, it goes right onto the agriculture. They use almost no fresh water for agriculture at all. And these pipes can be reversed. So if you have a lot of water and groundwater in one area, you can move it up somewhere else. And only then at the very, very end do you start thinking, where might desal make sense? And it might make sense, as people here have said, if it's for drinking water, if the population is on the coast, because it does cost a lot to move water, if it's a developed nation, and if you're out of all other choices. And only then, and even then, I think, was it Santa Barbara just voted no on, it's politically sensitive. So now, having said that, and now putting on our international basins hat, it can be, and these are not my words, a game changer in international relations. I think the Jordan Basin is a really interesting one. There's this new deal called the Green-Blue Deal, where UAE is helping to finance solar desalination solar energy in Jordan And some of that will go to Israel for desalination, and some of that desalinated water will come back to Jordan and Palestine. So this is all of it. It's a water scarce area. And so this may well unstick some of the stickiest geopolitical places. And in that case, it may well be worth the investment. But I think we're all in agreement that it's not the solution anywhere.
Great. Thank you, all panelists. Great comments, great remarks. We've spoken a little bit about this conflict versus cooperation paradigm. While some observers express fears of water wars among nations, sharing transboundary freshwater sources as a result of climate change, others note that low intensity but more chronic conflicts are likely to rise. In what regions, perhaps, are we more likely to expect the one versus the other, wars versus low-intensity conflicts? And how hopeful are you that both types of conflict can be either avoided and or resolved via negotiation? And Aaron, let's start with you on this one.
Oh, gosh. I was counting on building on everybody else's answers. So most of my attention is spent in the Western U.S. or internationally. And so I think I'm going to defer here to the lower level. I keep saying in the international realm, I don't see actual war over water ever happening. Now, I know at some point it will, and everybody from that point on will say, in contrast to everything Aaron Wolf has built his entire career around, this happens. But it's not, I mean, we've heard over and over the examples of why it doesn't. Water generally is going to agriculture, and it's a diffuse, low contribution to economies, and these aren't the high-level people who are making big decisions about war and peace, and there are treaties in place that the disincentive to launch a war across a border is so vast. And then what do you get? I mean, you can't move the water back, right? This is a cubic meter of water. It weighs a metric ton. And so the energy that it would take just to bring the captured water back, you could desalinate for much, much cheaper. So I think it doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make geostrategic sense. It wouldn't make sense, for example, if you're Egypt, to think about blowing up GERD, because where does all that water go? All that water comes rushing right back at you and takes out another couple of dams on the way down, and the flood in Cairo would be 8 meters high, right? So it doesn't make strategic sense. It doesn't make geopolitical sense. It doesn't make economic sense. And who knows? People are stupid, and somebody may well launch a war for. I mean, we know it's happening. So, having said all of that, I think again, I'll come back to the couple of things that I said before. One, and I really like the way Lama put it. We know that water drives crises and conflict and suffering and death, and Peter's database shows this from time immemorial. But it also captures people's attention, and it gives us a language to talk about a shared future. Here in the West, it brings people into the room that don't get in the room together. I'm regularly in a room with the ranchers and the environmentalists and the tribes and all kinds of people who are all over the spectrum, and they'll come into the room to talk about water. And it gives us a language to talk about what our future looks like. And that, I think, is true all over the world. So I think it's not only thinking about the cooperation potential, but actually actively trying to maneuver the conversation towards cooperation, the process of environmental peace building that people are talking about. And I think it's true on the international scale that it's viable and possible and incumbent on us. And I think it's also true at the subnational level. And I think I'll just end there saying that I remain an optimist only around this, around people not being rational, about people continuing to suffer and die, about ecosystems continuing to be degraded, about us continuously doing things that allow for human and ecosystem suffering. I'm wildly a pessimist. But around issues of war and peace, I actually think more optimistically.
Thank you. Lana.
Thank you. I'm also very much an optimist when it comes to this. I think it's a panel of optimists, I'd like to think, so I think that's a good thing. But that being said, you're absolutely right, everyone on this panel, is that on the transboundary level, if we are moving towards more cooperative, it looks like. On the local level, as Dr. Glick said, there are many numerous examples of conflict. So that being said, and this is something that I look at especially in my research as well, is if that's something sort of that we know is potential, and it does have the potential to escalate and have a ripple effect from a local level to a potentially intrastate level to maybe a regional level to maybe a transboundary level. Again, these are all maybes, but we don't know yet. But what we do know is that they do manifest on the local level and they can have ripple effects. But if that's the case, let's focus on the local level and let's see how we can prevent it on the local level before it manifests into something bigger. And that's something I look at in my region. So I'm a very big advocate of looking at community level work and climate adaptation and looking at sort of preventive water strategies on the local community level and how civil society can get engaged. So this idea of stakeholder participation and stakeholder inclusion is necessary for anything to actually really occur if we want to have preventive measures for conflict prevention on water wars or otherwise. If we look right now, we're talking about, COP is the climate change conference parties and how we can begin to look at mobilizing climate finance and what does that necessarily mean. The numbers tell us already right now we have a very big problem that 80% of the climate finance is going to mitigation and only 20% is going to adaptation. That's a very big problem for our sector, which is the water sector, which relies on adaptation. How do we look at climate adaptation and build more and more money to going into climate adaptation, specifically in the water sector? So if that's what we need to focus on, having more money go into adaptation in developing country contests, in hot zones, in water war regions, in areas that need it the most, where does that occur? And we look at the data in UNFCCC on the COPs, and we look at the climate adaptation is focusing primarily, again, on government level work. So how much of that is really going down and trickling down to the community level work where we know from the databases that, well, all the local problems, that's how they manifest into conflicts. So let's focus our adaptation efforts on the local level, but that money isn't reaching the community. And that's a very big problem. And that's where we really need to focus our efforts on getting climate adaptation to really focus on water prevention and measures on the community level work, on civil societies. So if we take examples from, for instance, Sudan. Sudan had this fantastic initiative about a number of years back called NAFIR, which was this community initiative that basically came together for climate adaptation during the seasonal floods. So Sudan has these floods that occur annually on a yearly basis in the summer months, which devastate Khartoum. Like, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of households that are completely destroyed down to the ground. And this isn't due to numerous factors. Some of them, of course, are climate exacerbated. They do have correlations towards the frequency and intensity of these rainfall patterns to be more intense due to climate change. But it's also basically because of watershed management. They've shed down the trees in that area. So there's a very big problem in why these floods reach Khartoum and devastate Khartoum. But that being said, NAFIR emerged when these houses in Khartoum were being completely devastated in order to rebuild Khartoum again, have climate adaptation, have watershed management around Khartoum to prevent these measures from occurring. And it was a beautiful, inspiring initiative. Why? Because A, the government of Sudan was too burdened to be able to deal with what was going on in Khartoum at that point in time. So this community-led initiative, which wasn't registered, wasn't an NGO, wasn't anything. It was literally a group of people that came together and let's work on something, which ended up being climate adaptation. It literally became a climate adaptation community initiative work, and it was beautiful. And it came to service and help in an area where the government was too burdened to support, so they were there to be able to pull that together and do that work. Well, for political reasons, they had to shut down, and I think I'll just keep it at that. But that being said, they were, for as long as they lasted, it was beautiful. A very similar initiative also in Egypt, this NGO called Very Nile, which has literally come into service when we talk about water quality. We also talk about pollution. We talk about how do we begin to help the actual, in a water-scarce country or in a water-scarce region, we not only talk about quantity, but we have to talk about quality as well. And they came and they emerged on the Nile to basically clean up at the pollution along the Nile. It's a beautiful initiative, be able to do it because, very frankly, the government is too burdened to also go down and deal with the water quality when they've got a million other things to do. So that being said, CSOs, civil society organizations, community initiatives have the ability to supplement and complement when we talk about climate adaptation and working on the community level, local water preventive conflicts that maybe the government necessarily can't do or doesn't have the capacity to do or can't necessarily reach. And that's where we really want to focus our efforts when we supply them with financing, helping support them in capacity building, helping them really shine so that we can help these people and help ourselves. Because if we're talking about the conflicts and the water wars occurring on a local level, let's prevent them from the local aspect from the very beginning before they spiral out of control into something larger. I think we really need to focus our efforts on that part.
Thank you. Dalal.
So I'll keep it brief since a lot of it has already been said. But definitely the flare-ups we're witnessing right now, most of them, if not, well, yeah, most of them involve non-state actors. So that means individuals, non-government militias, people movement across borders. So in northern Assam province, you have across the India and Bangladesh border, that's caused unrest. In Bangladesh itself, protests against the Rohingya refugees coming into Bangladesh. So because states, as Peter said earlier, do have diplomatic tools and norms to address these issues, but when you are in the subnational level, then it becomes more messy and more difficult to address because you have to be more careful. And one of the solutions is what Lama posited, which is dealing with the community level, with stakeholders at the community level, and engaging not just with governments, which is often what we see, but also with various stakeholders, including researchers and scientists who are working in these different countries, by having also approaches that might not necessarily seem the most traditional ones. And here I'm going to make a shameless plug just because I'm at UCI. We started working on a new project. We received a grant, an AXONET award from the National Science Foundation, a $2 million award to support the establishment of a network of networks on transboundary water security, bringing in experts from the Middle East, North Africa, from Central Asia, and from the US to come and share knowledge, address gaps together, and share data, and also bring people around the table who don't necessarily talk to each other. Governments might be talking to each other, but the scientists, the community leaders, do not necessarily exchange knowledge. And the story behind this actually is a good story because I go way back working with one of the faculty members here, Amir Agakushak, who's not physically present, but we worked a lot on the Middle East and North Africa. And it was by pure chance, I invited him to come to a workshop in Tashkent, mainly because I knew he spoke Farsi and he could communicate with our Afghan attendees. And when we were there and listening to the issues they were facing, we had this aha moment at the coffee break. We said, well, this is what we've been hearing all the way in the Middle East and why these people are not talking to each other. So there's an AXONET call by the National Science Foundation. Let's apply for it. He introduced me to Dave. And with our colleagues at Oklahoma State University, we put together that novel network of networks to basically bring people around the table so that we can address these issues way beforehand and before they actually flare up into local conflicts, etc.
Thank you, Dalal. Peter.
So I sort of like being at the end here now. So I agree with everything they all said. I'll start there. Those of you who don't know Aaron, when Aaron says he's in the room with farmers and he negotiates, Aaron is a remarkable negotiator. He has skills and training in this area. It's been a pleasure. I've had the pleasure to work with him for many years. Together, we actually organized a bunch of meetings, God knows how long ago, in, for example, the Kura-Arax River Basin between Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to bring scientists together to talk about how to share data and information about that shared international river basin. And we organized meetings at the Vatican and in Latin America. So he's been in the room. So I actually want to expand the conversation a little bit. I mentioned the water conflict chronology that we maintain at the Institute. We categorize conflicts over water in three ways. Water is a trigger of conflict, where access to or control of water is disputed and where violence occurs. And almost all of the conversation we've been having today has been where water is a potential trigger of violence. But the other two categories are water is a weapon of conflict, where water or water systems have been used in conflicts that start for political or ideological or whatever reason, but where water and water systems is used as a weapon, where dams are used to withhold water or to release water to flood a downstream community. And the third category is where water or water systems have been casualties or targets of conflict, where, again, a conflict starts for another reason, but where civilian water infrastructure is bombed, or where there are many other examples where water is a casualty of conflict. And the database includes all three of those kinds of conflicts. And strategies and solutions for reducing the risk of conflict depend on the kind of conflict we're talking about. Where water is a trigger, access to, control of, scarcity, I want your water, then we look at international treaties and shared river basins. We look at strategies to make sure that water is available to all communities. Those are strategies that we would use to help take water out of that kind of a conflict. Where water has been a weapon or a casualty of conflict, it's a different story and it's a different set of policies. And we have traditionally looked to international laws of war, for example, the Geneva Conventions, which are very explicit, especially the 1977 protocols, or 66 protocols, 66 protocols, that say civilian water infrastructure, water treatment plants, irrigation systems are off the table in conflicts, in theory. In practice, we then have to have a conversation about the failure of international legal systems, the failure of governments, the failure of militaries to abide by agreed upon laws of war. And then how do you bring that back into balance? And so there are different tools, there are different mechanisms for all of those things. The question raised the issue of low-level conflicts. Yes, the majority of the database entries in the water conflict chronology are low-level conflicts. They're not nation-to-nation, although there are examples of nation-to-nation issues as well. And then we get to the solutions that Lana raised, and I'm not going to repeat them. She was excellent in talking about the need for local solutions in that area, and I won't repeat that. I would finally say that look at the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war is an international conflict, and water is a factor. In 2014, after Russia took over the Crimea, the Ukraine cut off water in the Crimea Canal, the North Crimea Canal, that delivered 85% of the water that goes to Crimea, but originates on the territory of the Ukraine. And within days of the most recent conflict, Russians destroyed the dam on that canal, restoring water flows to Crimea. Again, if you're paying much attention to this conflict, in the first few days of that conflict, the Ukrainians intentionally flooded areas north of Kiev to slow down the Russian advance. So they used water, I guess you would call it as a weapon, to prevent or to slow the Russian advance on Kiev, a strategy that the Dutch used in the 1500s in the Spanish-Dutch War to stop the Spanish from attacking cities in the Netherlands. And so there's a long history of these kinds of conflicts. And of course, unfortunately, we've seen massive human suffering in the Ukraine because of the destruction of energy systems that are critical for providing safe water in the cities in the Ukraine, attacks on civilian water infrastructure. So we've seen all of the above in the most recent examples in the Ukraine. And so we need to work on solutions at all of those levels.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, panelists. As a facilitator, I never run out of questions, but I have the feeling that there are lots of good questions in the audience. If we're going to come around with a microphone, if you would please state your name and your affiliation, direct your question to any or all of the panelists. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Carol Moore. I'm the mayor of the city of Laguna Woods. One dynamic you haven't mentioned, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate everything you've said. I'm a great student of history, and I definitely will check out the chronology. I'm pretty aware of many of those ancient civilizations and their collapse. But there's one thing that hasn't been brought up, and I think it's critical to this whole argument. You never mentioned the corruption of a government. And today I noticed that in Orange County, if this number is correct, that 79% of the people worry more about corruption of government than they do about COVID or whatever. If that number is correct, I just saw it this morning. If that is correct, what I feel that is a part of this, there is the possibility of everything you've said, whether Ethiopia fills the dam too fast, all that can be, there's a lot of dynamics there. However, the degree of corruption in a government can prevent the dialogue that needs to go on. And I think that's a big factor that we can't dismiss. Thank you.
Any reaction from our panelists?
Agreed.
Agreed.
I mean, this is really sensitive. But I agree with you. I mean, I come from a region where it becomes very sensitive to talk about these kinds of issues, specifically publicly as well. But that being said, it's, of course, if we talk about even anything from climate adaptation to mitigation to looking at any solutions of infrastructure or readiness for vulnerable communities, you can't have any of that if there is no capacity to be able to deal with that on the government level. And if there is a vast void when it comes to corruption or otherwise, then having those kinds of dialogues are problematic, to say it nicely.
Go ahead.
The connection between water scarcity and tensions or local flare-ups, it's not just water scarcity per se, but it's also the perception or the fact that water is not distributed fairly. And that will lead to discontent. Yeah. So if the population loses trust in the ability of the government to manage this crisis, that's when trouble starts.
If I can add to that, that's actually beautiful. Thank you, Dalal. But there was this quote actually by Dr. Ismail Sorogoddin, who used to be in the World Bank, and he was one of the people actually who was talking about water wars. The narrative kind of propelled it through. But he actually said this one quote, and I love this quote because I use this consistently, is that there is more than enough water in the world, fresh water in the world, for irrigation, for industry, for domestic purposes. It is the distribution of that water that is failed. And I think that is spot on. Is that we do have access, we do have the potential to be able to feed everybody in this world, we do have access to give everybody potential water needs as much as that, but it's the distribution and that failed equity, which goes back to corruption, which is exactly what you said.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. The back.
Hi, my name is Boleslav Bochkai. I'm basically representing myself, but I work in a company that works in the municipal power and water industry. My question deals with the aspect of source of water that was not mentioned. Is the snowpack capture, and specifically how it was applied or not in California. Example being the Oroville Dam, 2018, overflowed because in the past the upstream dams were opposed by, in particular, environmentalist groups, which had in essence a veto. And that meant, of course, that the especially in 2018, the capture of water did not occur and the storage. Now, what is the impact specifically in California of the external actors in influencing the collection of water or the storage in reservoir, and how is it also outside of California, whether it's just United States or other regions of the world?
Yeah, so I'm going to respond to that one and push back a little bit. California has a lot of dams, a lot of big dams, a lot of big dams. Oroville's the second largest dam in the state. It's the largest state-run dam. Shasta's the largest federal dam. We have thousands of dams. The problem with California is not a lack of dams. And in 2017, when the big flooding occurred in Oroville, the problem was dam design and maintenance. That was a problem at that particular dam. But it was also a problem of climate. And I'm not talking about causality, but influence. And my dissertation many, many years ago now, too long ago to remember, was one of the first to look at the impacts of climate change on snowpack in California. Snowpack is a huge amount of storage for water in California. Well, we would never, ever be able to build enough dams to replace that. The challenge is going to be how to manage the dams we have in the context of the changing hydrology that climate is imposing now, and possibly the faster loss of snowpack. We're getting more rain, less snow. The snow's melting earlier. We might build one or two more big dams in California, maybe. It's going to be a bigger challenge to manage what we have in the face of climate change, and perhaps figure out how to capture more water in groundwater storage, where we overdraft groundwater, we pump it faster than nature recharges it. If we can recharge our groundwater, that's a potential new source of storage of faster melting snowpack. So it's a question of management in the face of changing hydrologic conditions of the existing infrastructure and managing that infrastructure in a new way. Yeah. Oh, internationally, maybe that's less the case. There are still opportunities for new big dams. I would argue they better be built in a different way than we built them, when we didn't care about or know about ecological impacts or impacts on downstream communities or local communities, or the local communities had no say. So when Lana talks about bringing local voices into the conversation, that would be new for some of the big dam construction. And now a lot of the big dam construction is China, inside of China, but also outside of China in Africa. So let's think about big new infrastructure, but think about it in a different way and make sure that it's built when it's built in a way that respects local communities and respects local ecosystems in a way that we've never done in the past.
I'll just add to that, and I don't know about Oroville or Shasta, but in Oregon we're dealing with the same thing. We're getting more rain, less snow, which means we're getting the water in the rivers at an inconvenient time for our uses, and so we're talking about storage for the first time probably since the 60s. And we're looking at exactly these kinds of options. Can you store it in aquifers and all kinds of complications that go along with that. But another interesting thing that you raise is the relationship between energy and water. And so the interesting kind of perverse incentives of a lot of the climate change dialogue categorizes some dams as green energy, which in a lot of China, Southeast China, for example, they're talking again about building dams that they had shelved to get the green credits, and which in turn, because there's no market for the energy, so that's in turn drawing industries like smelting and cryptocurrency mining. These are things, I mean, if I think about the things that I was trained in water back in the day, none of this was on the table. And I think thinking about our new demands on energy and its relationship to hydropower and water in general is a new useful category of things to think about.
I mean, the only thing I'll add, just to build on that very briefly, is that For a very long time, the World Bank actually stopped investing in dams and hydropower dams simply because of this region, the reason, that it wasn't pegged as a green climate, it wasn't pegged as green energy anymore. And this is largely due to the methane emissions that were coming out of large reservoirs. That being said, if we're talking about more small or medium scale dams, there could be potential net gains in terms of green energy emission targets, if that's what we're aiming for. But the way that dams have been done in the past, and I would agree completely with Peter Glick on this, is that they have not been sustainable on any way. If we have a methodology in order to be able to begin to do it, and only very recently has the World Bank thought about the process of beginning to invest into those kinds of dams once again, it's because for the longest time they just refused to even touch them. And so.
Dalal, any final
Nothing
thoughts?
to add.
All right.
Yeah.
Further questions? Yes.
My name's Bob Simon. I'm a UCI graduate. As professionals, how much of your energy is devoted to bureaucratic resistance and bureaucratic indifference?
I don't think there's a number high enough to capture that. Can I ask more about the question? Where's it coming from, and what's behind the question?
Yeah.
He's a good negotiator.
Well, I love UCI. I graduated medical school here back in the 70s. And I want it to be even greater and stronger than it is. And there are institutions. The institution is very slow to move, very slow to yield to ideas and accept changes.
Huh.
And I think it's across our society. I didn't want to get up on my high horse, but just I expect that you're experiencing the same thing. You have great ideas, you have science, but they push back or they don't listen or just not much happens.
So I think that's a great question. I'm a scientist by training. I work at a research institute that looks at the intersection between science and policy. But broadly speaking, many of the problems we face, including the ones we've been discussing, I would argue are not really difficult scientific questions. Mm-hmm. But they're policy questions and institutional questions. Even the climate issue, there are still climate deniers out there, but they are so out there now. They're the flat earthers. The challenge with climate is institutional. And there are a couple of aspects of it. One is often the way professionals in my field are trained is outmoded. In the water area, for example. Water planners and managers, and I have some training in this area also, have been trained historically to think about water supply. That population's growing, our economy's growing. The assumption has always been that demand for water will also grow. Therefore, we have to think about how to meet new supply. So the training is a little outmoded now, where in many places new supply isn't really an option. But thinking about the way we use water, demand for water, use what we already have more effectively, it's a new way of thinking. Instead of building a reservoir that can supply 100,000 people, how do you provide low-flow toilets and efficient washing machines and dishwashers that cut the demand by the same amount? It's a different way of thinking, and so education and training is an institutional issue. But another aspect of the institutional problem is that there are some institutions for which the current status quo is important to maintain. And I would point provocatively to the fossil fuel industry, which has a very clear economic vested interest in continuing to do what they do very well, which is find, extract, sell, and burn carbon-based fuels, where we know now scientifically the planet can't afford that any longer. But there's an institutional barrier to overcome there that's very difficult to do. And so there are a lot of institutional barriers that prevent us from doing the things that I would argue the science tells us very clearly now we need to do.
I'd love to have more of a conversation about what your experiences are that lead to this supposition, and asking in the water world what it's like. And I think probably like everywhere, we deal with big bureaucracies, and if only the world did everything the way I want it to, it would be wonderful. And surprisingly, there's pushback when I propose that. And I also am really sympathetic to the bureaucracy behind. I mean, when you said you got $2 million from NSF, my first thought was, oh man, that's going to be so hard to manage, because it is. And it's deeply exciting that we have a government that is able to support this kind of effort to this kind of level. Having said all of this, and I'm an outsider here, but I think this is my 4th or 5th time here. I love coming here, and I love here specifically as a model. UCI, I spend a lot of time with water-related universities around the world, and there's some stuff that you guys do better than absolutely anybody. If you look in the room, you've got private industry in here. Almost, for most universities, especially public universities, they're just not invited in the room. You've got social scientists and hard scientists in the same room, and that in and of itself is, I mean, even getting the groundwater and the surface water people in the same room can be difficult in some places. So I can tell just from my brief forays here that the walls are really, really low, that the creativity is really, really high, and the focus on problem solving, regardless of who the stakeholders are that are impacted by the problem, but also who the stakeholders are to create a solution. This is a really unique place, and whatever other bureaucratic issues there may be, I think it's well worth appreciating what you do have here, because it's pretty unique.
Okay. We have one final question, which we pulled off of the internet, and I'll go ahead and just defer, and please stick around for the reception. You can also interact with our panelists. This was touched upon a little bit, but thoughts by the panelists on big dams versus micro-scale projects, hydropower projects in particular, and or smaller projects on channelized rivers. Any reaction? Any thoughts?
What's your favorite?
I hate to keep referring to things that I've done. It seems so easy. But my master's thesis was on big dams versus little dams. So I've thought about it a little bit. Every energy option, every water option has pros and cons. Big dams stop up rivers and are really bad for fish. Big dams have big reservoirs and lose a lot of water to evaporation. But lots of small dams also have environmental impacts. And in California, we have a mix. We have a lot of big dams and we have a lot of small dams. And so neither, both. I'm not sure how best to answer that, except to say you have to look at the context. You have to look at what you're trying to do. You have to look at the local ecosystem and the hydrology. You have to look at the benefits and all the costs. And let me just say one more thing about that. None of us are economists, I don't think. No. So,
God, no.
Economists are really good at putting values on certain things. The hydropower produced, the water that goes to agriculture that produces crops, the water that we take out of the system. They're really bad at evaluating impacts on ecosystems. How do you measure the extinction of a species economically? How do you... this is a real challenge, and there's a whole field of economics called ecological economics that's trying to do this. But it's really hard. And so one of my co-panelists here mentioned the cost-benefit analysis approach that has traditionally been used to evaluate these kinds of projects. That's really important, except to understand that often many of the costs or benefits of some of these projects are not easily measured economically, and that we have to think about that. Costs of conflict, to get it back to conflict, are badly incorporated into some of the judgments about what we need to do.
Great.
I just want to mention, I'm sorry, were you starting?
No, please go.
know a lot myself, but I went to southwest China with a colleague of mine, Desiree Tullis, up in Oregon State, looking at precisely this question. In the area, there's the Mekong, what they call Lancang, and what we call the Salween, or the New River in southwest China. And a lot of big dams on the Lancang, or the Mekong, and they were talking about a whole series of big dams on the New River, which at some point got shelved for precisely these sets of reasons. So what they were encouraging instead was really micro dams, and this comes back to the mayor's question about corruption. One of the interesting things that happens is the authority drops to the local level, and almost none of them ever got their permits denied. All of them got permitted. And precisely what Peter suggested is exactly what happened. Little tributaries were getting dried up entirely, and nobody was watching because this didn't rise to the level of national monitoring. And when they did the calculations to generate the same amount of power using small dams, you would do vast greater ecologic damage with the smaller dams than you would with a well-managed large dam high up on the main stem. So yeah, just what Peter said is you got to think where you're doing it, and also who's keeping an eye on it and who has authority to mitigate the impacts.
Lama and Bilal, final words?
Yeah. Okay. Very briefly, to add on to what's already been said, is that sort of this aspect of the economics and how does this factor into whether it be ecological sort of large infrastructure projects or otherwise. And this is something also I tend to look at in my research, is when we're looking at sort of the drivers, what are the drivers towards whether it be conflict, cooperation, or even just sort of manifesting this? Very often, and I've seen this empirically specifically, is that the main motive for cooperation and or conflict actually is economic. It's very much economic. And it comes down to, well, okay, if we can identify that, we can begin to look at what does that necessarily mean and how does that manifest for states in terms of economic development, particularly for developing country contexts. What does that mean to incentivize them then also towards, means of ecological sustainability, whether it be through looking at our ecosystems for climate change or otherwise. And I think that that's a very, very big, that's a huge field, just as Peter mentioned, is that looking at sort of the climate or the economics of climate change. I mean, Stern, from the Stern Review in the UK came out, that was sort of the big pioneering in climate economics. But not just that, but how do we begin to look at mutual benefit sharing opportunities, specifically when we look at large-scale dams, or if we're talking about basins that share a resource, or transboundary basins. I mean, the common, are you all familiar with the sort of the orange example? There's the orange example when we look at states, and this is often used, Larry Susskind and Shafi Islam in Tufts University and in Harvard University often use this example of the orange because they talk about water diplomacy and what incentivizes states in order to motivate them towards water diplomacy and hence cooperation when we talk about economics. They always use the orange as the example. And the idea is if you've got 3 states and everybody wants the orange, everybody's fighting over this one orange, right? And we don't necessarily know why everybody wants this one orange, but we begin to look at, okay, well, person X wants the orange because they want the peel, because it has the aroma and the medicinal properties that they would be able to use for, for themselves to, as a perfume. Somebody else wants the pulp of the orange because, they've got digestive issues and it helps them with fiber, so it's great for them for the pulp. Somebody else just wants the juice. Like somebody really just wants the juice of the orange, and that's all they want out of the orange. They're just going to leave the rest of the orange. So if we begin to identify with this analogy of the orange, that what are the actual needs and desires of everybody, then we can actually have mutual benefit sharing opportunities where it's a win-win for everybody. The same applies in water diplomacy on transboundary river basins between, when we talk about infrastructure projects, we talk about anything, it's just identifying what are the needs of the communities and identifying the needs of stakeholders to really make it an inclusive process for win-win cooperation. And I think that's the crux of it. So it's not just looking at sort of the economics of it, it's really looking at, well, okay, let's take the ecological integrity of the basin too. What is the ecosystem? How is that sustainable? What are the social value in terms of communities being upheld, and how do they have a voice in this process? So it's really taking all of the facets together and making sure that that's all being done in a holistic manner. So,
Thank you, Lama.
Last word, Lama.
And one final thing just to add to this is, in addition to this, the ability of the scientists to communicate effectively the science, which seems to be more or less, in most cases, non-contentious, because that's the simple part, as Peter said, to communicate it and make it valuable to the policymakers who will then translate it into action. So that's the evidence to action part, which is not always trivial, but it's very important.
Thank you. This has been extraordinary, illuminating, provocative. We could clearly go on for another hour at least. Aaron, Lama, Dalal, Peter, thank you very much. Please give our panelists